So what is church? I grew up in the church, and I think in our generation, everyone is trying to reinvent church or expand church or find the emergent church and get back to the Orthodox church. And what for me as a jail chaplain has been really helpful is to just go back to Jesus's founding statement of when he makes the church. Like, we don't need to reinvent it. What is Jesus's definition? And so we look at Matthew 16, and that's where Jesus says, all right, on you, Peter, which is rock, so it's a street tough name. He's not dealing with religious leadership. He's dealing with a blue-collar worker. He says, look, on you, bro, I found my ecclesia, my church. And if this is the founding time of this, what is Jesus' imagination? This ecclesia, it's not a building, for sure, because he's not going to build a building on Peter. But on you, I build my ecclesia. And we know that's like some sort of assembly, or I like to think it's a movement, because the rest of the sentence is, on you I build my ecclesia, my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. And so whatever he's building on Peter, this movement, this assembly, it's headed towards something. It's a movement. So on you, rock, I build my movement, the church. And where is it headed? Is it headed to heaven? No. Not headed to heaven. What? Where is it headed? The gates of Hades will not stand against it. Well, Hades, what's that? Well, we could say that's hell. We can go into the Greek understanding of Hades is the realm of death. It's a realm of death, and it has gates. We're not about trying to get into heaven. Heaven doesn't have gates. Heaven is coming in the Son of Man, in Jesus, and he's catalyzing a movement on earth as it is in heaven, that is headed towards the gates of hell, the realm of death where people are trapped. And this is where Jesus wants to smash, defy, invade the realm of death and conquer the realm of death, vacate the realm of death. And so that's on us. And so when I preach on this, sometimes I've only got to do it a few times in churches. We're in a big fancy Episcopalian church. When we did, and I was speaking with my friend Nieners, who spent years in prison and in gangs. My question is, so if this is now, because Jesus didn't say, Peter, do this after you die. There's no afterlife concept of Hades. Jesus' understanding of Hades is now. He's commissioning him and sending him off now. Where is the gates of Hades? Now. So if we don't know where the gates of Hades are, as a church, we don't know where we're going. Because, once again, the founding statement, the church is headed towards the gates of Hades, which will not prevail against it. So most of us as the church, we don't know where the gates of Hades are, and I think that's why we don't know where we're going. So I oftentimes, when I get to preach on this, I'll say, for me, the gates of Hades are the American prison system, because that's my context. That's where I see people who are in an underworld of death and destruction and pain and captivity. And as the church going in and doing Bible study, I feel that's the best incarnation of what church is. That's not like a parachurch ministry. I feel that's the heart of what the ecclesia is as we invade the gates of Hades and bring God's life to the dead. But I'll say, where else are the gates of Hades? And people in the church will say, like, addiction or domestic violence, homelessness. Great. All right. So now let's look at those. How does the church defy those gates of Hades? And I think that is the right image that Jesus charges in Peter's imagination. It's like, these are places that have very strong barriers. I see this when Jesus crosses the water on the boat and goes to the land of the Gadarenes and sees the demoniac, the man possessed by demons who's right there in the realm of death. He's in Hades, and the gates of Hades charge at him. The demonic forces want to push him out, but Jesus invades those with his power and his truth. You see that anytime that Jesus is, right there on the cross. This is the realm of death. On the skull of Golgotha, Jesus, he is the embodiment of heaven. He's going to the place of death socially. And then it goes even deeper into the real realm of death. And who imagines that? Peter. Peter in 1 Peter, his letter imagines that Jesus went and preached good news to the dead, or imprisoned spirits, it says. So I think it makes sense that Peter has this imagination later on when he writes this letter, because he's the one who got this whole mission dumped on him. Right there in Matthew 16. So yeah, I think if the church reclaimed Jesus's imagination, we could then unify our different strengths, the liturgical types, the evangelical types. We all need each other if we're going to bust through these gates of Hades, because it's scary.
Tell us about the story of Lazarus and how you lay that out as a ministry program in terms of removing stones, unwrapping cloth, and so on.
So we've really been almost like doing a Lectio Divina for years now on Jesus's most elaborate story of resurrection in John 11. Jesus raised his people from the dead a few times, but this is the one where we get a real play-by-play and what happens in Jesus' resurrection of his friend. So friendship is at the core too. Jesus' friendship with the dead is that he speaks his name while he's still dead. He calls him. So this is the miraculous act of God. Once again, in the underground, in Hades. The story begins there. Jesus' attention on Hades. And this is the gates of Hades, the stone here, right? So then Jesus doesn't miraculously move the stone, and Lazarus isn't magically all of a sudden well. There's a few things that need to happen to welcome this drama of resurrection. First, the word of Jesus in the darkness and the underground. But then he tells normal people, roll away that stone. What's a stone doing there? This is a societal obstacle that is intentionally crafted, shaped, and put there and meant to be hard to move because we want really strong structural boundaries between the dead and the living. And I guess it makes sense when people are dead, you want that to be separate. But when Jesus starts messing with who's dead and who's alive, then we need to be experts as Jesus followers of manipulating the social boundaries to facilitate what Jesus is doing. So if he's bringing the dead back to life, well, then that stone's got to move. Otherwise, you've got a stillborn resurrection. And I think that happens a lot with guys that I work with as a jail chaplain, that we get to be in the underground, in jails, in prisons, and cells, and seeing guys come back to life. But then they try to come back into the land of the living. And I wish it were just a very clear stone, because it would be clear what they're bumping their head up against. But for us, all the stones are driver's license, debt, more debt, criminal debt, medical debt, restitution debt, collections fines, bills, fees, so many hoops that people have to jump through to get housing, transportation. They can't get to their job because they don't have a car, but if they drive their car without their driver's license, but they can't get their driver's license until they pay off these fines, but they can't pay off the fines until they have a job that gets the money. And so that is one shape of a huge stone that guys bump into and eventually go back to the underworld. So drugs, medicating their pain, getting arrested, going back to prison. It's designed very well, this big round stone. So what we do as a ministry at Tierra Nueva is a lot of times the mundane, heavy, sweaty work where you get bruises, just moving stones, taking guys to courts, writing letters, raising money to pay off collections fees, to roll away the stone so that the resurrection Jesus is doing in folks can come into our community. But there's one more step, right? It's not just the stone. Lazarus comes out looking like a mummy. He's wrapped up with all that stuff that bodies need when they're dead to be wrapped up in the darkness and to preserve them. And so the layers that we call them, the next thing Jesus says is unbind him. He doesn't tell Lazarus, you got to change. It's really, these are things that are wrapped around him. And so we use that image of layers to help folks identify what's the violence, the misogyny, the racism, the hatred, the addiction, the isolation, the different ways that you've wrapped yourself up in the darkness as we walk with people in a more, I guess, pastoral care or therapeutic way. Discipleship, you could say, inner healing, of ways of them looking at those things, not as something, hey, you need to change to become a Christian now, but a more contemplative understanding of who is the true you and what are all these things that you're used to being thinking of as you, and how can we slowly, gently, prayerfully unbind you from these ways of thinking to discover the true, liberated, free you, because no one wants to walk around like a mummy, but it's normally those addictions and those angers that literally trip people up. I guess figuratively trip people up, but Lazarus's layers could physically trip him. So we just use those images to see Jesus' work of resurrection in the underground, our participation with Jesus of doing just, it's not miraculous work. It was just really them using their sweat and their muscles and their teamwork to roll away that stone. How we can roll away and slowly help budge societal barriers in individuals' ways, and then helping them gently remove so many of the layers which are painful and which smell and which hurt, but is not the true them, so that they can discover who they really are. And we get to be up close to Jesus' miracles of resurrection.
So you get a descent and ascent in this movement.
Yeah, so the church is all about descent. The arrow is down. Heaven goes downwards to earth, and then the church goes down to Hades. As we follow Jesus, he's the leader of this movement. He's the first one that did it, and then his resurrection goes up, and then we see what this looks like societally is the church going to the place of the dead, of pain, of Satan's domain, and then there's the ascent. So the church descends into the underground, and then Lazarus is one really helpful slow model of what resurrection looks like. So the drum of salvation of Jesus' descent and ascent is really, he's just carving the path of the shape of our whole life, and our ecclesial movement. So the church is about descent and ascent.
So how would you articulate the gospel? What's the good news then in that whole package? You come to someone like Nieners, and here's the good news, and he's in the midst of his hell. Let's say in solitary confinement. Nieners, I have good news for you.
Well, I think one way to say it then is most people who are suffering, who are in hell, maybe whether they use that word or not, they assume that God is the warden of their hell. They assume that, well, whatever this effing life is where I'm suffering, my brother died and I can't get any break and this world hates me and there's racism, like if God is letting this happen, they assume that God's in control of the hell that they're in. And so every inmate hates the warden. And so when a chaplain comes to them and says, let me tell you how good the warden is, and they also share this bad theology that God is in control of the world, there's no way you can polish a turd. There's no way you can get someone to swallow that really yucky news that, like, do I really want to be cuddly with the warden? Is he a good guy? I don't know. I hate this life. But if you really help them switch to no, God comes to us in Jesus, and in Jesus we see a God who's not in control, but a God who's very about changing how things are. Not saying, hey, everything that happens in this world happens for a reason, that kind of like pseudo-paganistic phrase that most people have. Fatalism is what it is. Jesus is saying, hey, I want to bring a totally different realm, a totally different way, government, kingdom of heaven to this world and change everything. And the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go right at the belly of the beast of suffering and where Satan has control in your life. And we're going to break into your hell. We're going to love you. You're going to feel God's presence, the whole incarnation that God himself breaks into this world. And God's love is here right now, both incarnationally, hopefully in our relationship as a minister, as well as in the spirit. And he can go deeper than my words can. And Jesus is with you in hell. And we're going to walk with you as he liberates you from hell. And then he might call you to join the movement and keep going deeper into hell and bringing heaven deeper into hell until hell is no more.